So Shimon and I are going, this is unrehearsed. So this is all going to be spontaneous. And for this interview,
maybe I'll tell them what it is.
You tell them what this is, all right.
This interview documents the first time that I met with one of our saviors, a Polish man from my city of Brzeżany, whom I didn't see for almost 40 years since we left Brzeżany, and this took place in Israel in May 1986. So just, I wanted you to get the impression. Okay.
קרול קודובני, בן ה-70, פולני, נוצרי, שהציל את חייו של דוקטור שמעון רדליך, את חיי בני משפחתו בימים הנוראים ההם של מלחמת העולם השנייה שם בפולין, בעיירה קטנה, ולראשונה מאז 1945, חלפו מאז כ-41 שנה, נפגשו אתמול השניים, המציל מפולניה והניצול, שהוא אז היה ילד בן 8 והיום הוא דוקטור להיסטוריה באוניברסיטת בן-גוריון, ושניהם כאן איתנו. שלום לך דוקטור רדליך, שלום לך מר קודובני, שלום מדבר עברית לצערנו, אנחנו נסתייע בך. אולי תוכל לומר לנו דוקטור רדליך בכמה מילים את הנסיבות שבהן הצילו את חייך וחיי בני משפחתך, האיש היקר הזה.
ובכן, אני אעביר את עצמנו אחורה לשנת 1943, בקיץ אותה שנה התבצע יודנריין, או חיסול סופי של הגטו בעיירה שבה התגוררנו, ברzeżany במזרח פולין, ונאלצנו להסתתר במחבוא, בבונקר שבתוך הגטו שהיה חצי הרוס. כמובן שאחת השאלות המרכזיות הייתה עניין המזון. באותו לילה שנגמרו המזונות הקודמים שלנו, אמי וסבי זיכרונו לברכה, צעדו באמצע לילה למשפחת קדובני, דפקו בדלת והם לא ידעו מה יקרה, האם יפתחו או לא, כי לא כולם פתחו את הדלתות. הדלת הזאת נפתחה והכניסו אותם פנימה, ומאותו יום במשך כחצי שנה, כל שבוע, הם היו באים בלילה לקבל מזון ומביאים את המזון הזה.
לאחר המלחמה אני מבין אותק הקשר ביניכם. אז איך בכל זאת מצאת אותו מחדש?
הקשר נותק כי היינו בשני עולמות שונים, דיברתי איתו על זה לפני כן. וכנראה שגם עניין של התבגרות פסיכולוגית מסוימת. בגיל מסוים התחלתי, כמו שאומרים, לחזור לשורשים, ואימי גם עודדה אותי לקשור מחדש קשרים עם אנשים שבהסתכנות חייהם עזרו לנו באותה תקופה. שלחתי מכתב לאותה עיר שחשבתי שלשם הוא עבר אחרי המלחמה, בלי כתובת, בלי שום פרטים, רק את השם שלו, ולהפתעתי הרבה, אחרי מספר שבועות, קיבלתי ממנו מכתב מעיר אחרת. המכתב הגיע אליו.
אז אולי תשאל אותו, בשפה שאתם מכירים, כיצד באמת הגיע המכתב אליו בדרך לא דרך, אם אתה יכול עכשיו?
Jak pan dostał ten list, który posłałem do pana?
Ten list przyszedł z biegiem okoliczności. Mianowicie ten list przyszedł bez poczty, bez policji, był zaadresowany Lolek.
I think that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, they want to see another 2 minutes.
Okay,
it's very short.
They want to see it. Tell them the whole thing.
Karol, a ja się nazywam Karol, a wolali mnie kiedyś w Brzeżanach Lolek. Później przyszedł Chojnów, koło Legnicy, nic więcej.
המכתב הגיע עם שם שלא היה מאויד כל כך נכון, שם הקטנה שלו, רק שם העיר חוינוב על יד העיר לגניצה, בלי שום פרטים נוספים.
I list ten otrzymał listonosz, znając mego kuzyna Kodoni. Poszedł do mego kuzyna i pyta się, kto to jest Lolek. I on powiedział, to jest Lolek, mój brat, który mieszka w Zabrzu. I ten list mnie dostał do Zabrzu.
כן, ובכן, הדבר שהכיר איש אחר בשם משפחה כמו שלו בעיר הזאת, הלך אליו עם המכתב, עשה מאמץ מיוחד, ואותו איש קרא את המכתב והבין מתוך התוכן שהכוונה אל אדון קדובני, ושלח אותו לעירו שהיא זבשה.
ואתה יכול לומר, על מה התכתבתם בעצם? אתם כל השנים האלה, עוד השנים על קשר, עכשיו התראיתם, מיד נגיע לזה, אבל מה התכתבתם?
התכתבנו קודם כל על הזיכרונות מהתקופה ההיא. אני סיפרתי לו מה זכור לנו, הוא סיפר לי מה זכור לו מאותה תקופה. והתכתבנו גם על דברים אחרים, כמו על בעיה של עזרה או אי סיוע ליהודים מצד פולנים, ועוד נושאים שונים.
אני מבקש לך לשאול אותו, הוא עומד, כידוע לך, עכשיו אולי לצופים, לזכות בתואר המאוד נכבד של חסיד אומות העולם, מטעם יד ושם, תשאל אותו אם בכלל הוא שמע בפולין על תואר כזה.
Pan teraz dostanie ten tytuł Sprawiedliwa Świata. Czy w Polsce pan w ogóle słyszał, że tak o tym tytule?
Ja o tym tytule słyszałem parę lat przedtem i nieraz o was myślałem, ale nie wiedziałem, gdzie wy mieszkacie, co wy robicie i nie zgłaszałem.
הוא שמע על התואר מספר שנים לפני כן עדיין, אבל וחשב אז עלינו כשהוא שמע על כך, אבל לא ידע איפה אנחנו, מה אנחנו עושים, זה נשאר בגדר מחשבות.
ואתמול שנפגשתם, לא תיארת, בני דמיונך ראית אותו? זאת אומרת, היית יכול לזהות אותו?
יכולתי לזהות אותו בגלל התמונות שהוא שלח לי, התצלומים שלו, אבל על פי זיכרונות מהעבר בוודאי, עברו למעלה מ-40 שנה.
תוכל לומר לו מטעם המנחה והצופים שהוא איש קדוש, והיו מעטים כמותו, לצערנו.
Wszyscy tu mówią panu, że pan jest świętym człowiekiem i
ja mogę tylko z tego miejsca być wdzięczny Pan, Tobie i w ogóle, że mogę uczestniczyć będę uczestniczył w tak dla mnie rozrzewnej sytuacji, prawda?
במילה אחת הוא מודה לי שבגללי הוא יכול להשתתף בטקס בעל המשמעות החשובה הזאת.
תודה רבה לשניכם. תודה לך, אדוני. עלית מאוד.
I have to say this, it's very sweet actually, because the TV interviewer, yes, thank you. The TV interviewer, what's his name? I forget. Oh, Gidon Reicha. For those of you who don't know Hebrew or Polish, he called him at the very end. He said of one of Shimon's rescuers, he said he was a holy man. Yeah, Ish Kadosh. That's something. That's really something. So I want to say that this. Let me talk for a second. This interview is based, first of all, let me say who Shimon is for those of you who don't know, and then we'll go into the interview. So very briefly, I should also say that Shimon and I have been very close friends for the last 15 years. I always think I've met him, I've called him my mentor. So Shimon is a professor emeritus at Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba. He now lives in Modi'in. He was born in 1935 in Lviv, which was then Poland, now Lviv, Ukraine. Okay, thank you. It's like my second father. And then after being born in Lviv, he's lived in Brzezany, or in eastern Poland, called Berezany in Ukraine. The Soviets came to his city in 1939 when Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Nazis came in the summer of 1941, and they were there in his town until the summer of 1944. In June 1943, the family moved into a ghetto with all the other Jews, and the Brzezany ghetto was liquidated in June 1943, and that is when Shimon, with his mother and two grandparents, went into hiding in the ghetto, which was now former ghetto because it had been liquidated, and they remained there until January 1944 for roughly 6 months. And then from January 1944, together once again with his family, most of his family, not all of his family, he went into hiding with a Ukrainian peasant family in a small village near Brzezany in Polish. The Polish friends will understand the irony of this town, Raj, which in English means paradise.
Well, for us it was paradise.
It was paradise, yes, it was paradise. So the town where he was actually hidden was called a paradise, and it was paradise. I shouldn't say irony, it's remarkable, quite honestly. And then he remained there until summer of 1944, when the Soviets began the liberation of eastern Poland. He returned to his town of Brzezany, and he lived there under Soviet occupation for 1 year until the summer of 1945. And then in the summer of 1945, he and his family moved to the Polish town of Łódź, or Lodz, and remained there until January 1950, when he and his family came to Israel. Those are the very basic facts. Shimon has written a lot. Of course, he was a scholar of Soviet Jewish history, East European Jewish history, and then in the 1990s he embarked on a new project telling his life in a very distinctive way, based on his own memories, based on interviews with people, based on his own historical research. There are 3 books. One is based on his life in Bjezhany. The other is on the life after the war in the city of Łódź. And then most recently, in the last year or so, a book based on his first years in Israel's first decade. So it's a trilogy of his life until roughly 1954-55. I know those books very well, and I know Shimon very well, but this interview is based on this television interview from 1986. Shimon gave a very long videotaped interview in 1993 with AMHA, which is an Israeli organization devoted to the welfare of Holocaust survivors. He gave a very extensive interview in 2017 at Yad Vashem, and that will be at the heart of our interview today. There's also a film, a documentary film made by a common friend of ours, Sławomir Greenberg, who produced a film called Shimon's Returns, which was released in 2014. So, but this interview is largely based on his interview in 1993, and especially on his interview at Yad Vashem in 2017. And as you can see from the TV interview, Shimon, who's a child survivor of the Holocaust and also an acclaimed historian, in his work concentrates heavily on rescue. And I wanted to ask you first, why this, in your work and in your interviews, especially in 1993 and 2017, why do you emphasize rescue, I would say, much more than many other historians and also survivors of the Holocaust?
One reason is because I was rescued. But as a historian, for many years, until recently, in Poland, because of the communist regime, and in Israel, because of common stereotypes, the rescue theme, I think, was in a way muffled or limited. By the way, today, the same issue, and I'm talking now about contemporary problems, the same issue is being reversed, at least in Poland. And I have serious problems about how to talk about rescue, because today the current Polish government does the opposite of what was done under the communist regime. They enlarge it. They artificially emphasize rescue versus collaboration. Rescuers versus Szmarcownicy and others who persecuted Jews. So for many, many years, I tried to defend the Poles. Today, I feel like attacking not the Poles as a nation, chas v'chalila, but the image which is being created by the current government. And sorry, I live in the contemporary world. As much as I disapprove of political manipulations of the Holocaust theme in Poland, I disapprove of political manipulations of the Holocaust in my own country. Both are falsifying history, to my opinion. But let's get back to my own.
Let's go back to the
So, of course, as a historian, we try to get as close to the reality as we can. We can never be 100% close to what happened, because we as historians, we are also human beings, and each one of us is being affected by his roots, by his cultural world, by the ideologies that influenced him. So I'm aware of my limitations, but for many, many years, I tried in a way to balance the general image, the general popular image as Jews of victims, and all the others, not only Germans, but also Poles and even more Ukrainians, as the oppressors, as the victimizers, as the murderers. That's more or less my answer.
Yeah. So I want to move to especially the 1993 and 2017 interviews that you gave. And we can't show them here, they're both very long, but they're both about 3 hours long. In 1993, and also want to pay attention, I'm not an expert at this, but there are probably people in the room who are, body language, for example. It's very interesting just to watch Shimon's body language between 1993 and 2017. In 1993, you gave an interview to Amcha, and you basically, I wouldn't call it superficial, but it was the basic outline of your life, without going into too much depth on any one particular issue. And in that interview, for those of you who understand body language, I don't, but be curious, he sits like this the whole time. He's sipping coffee or tea and looks very relaxed, but a little bit nonchalant, I would say.
Detached, maybe.
Detached, maybe. That detached is very emotionally detached and relaxed and talk. In 2017, through 3 hours, he's sitting like this the whole time. I say, this looks to me like a person who feels vulnerable in some way. Once in a while he would gesture with his hand, but then he always held his hand, it was like this always. And I said, you know, his hand is over his heart. He's protecting himself in some way. So he feels much more vulnerable than why. And I think one reason that you feel much more vulnerable in 2017 than in 1993 is that you reveal so many more intimate details. In 2017, for example, about your parents, and your grandparents and others, and I'm wondering, why did you feel in 2017 that you wanted to be more intimate? Tell them very intimate things about your mother.
Let's go into these details a little bit later.
No, but why did you feel that?
Let me just add a few remarks.
Yes.
I'm not a psychologist. I can just think about certain things. In this first interview of 1993, I was like reporting. I was like, and people who do interviews, and by the way, I don't want to boast about myself, but I was among the first ones in Israel back in the 1960s who started doing oral history. And since then, I do it over decades again and again, and I value it. I'm aware of the pitfalls of oral history, but I like it. So why was I like this in 1993? One reason was that I was like reporting. I didn't go too much into details. In the 2017 interview, I'm much, much older, and I have a feeling that this is my last testimony. And I want to get out things that I didn't testify or didn't talk about previously. Another point for those who do oral history in interviews, you know that very much depends on the interviewer. The better the interviewer is informed and knows the general background and the context of things, usually the better the interview will be. In the Amcha interview, this was not a historian, not a person who specialized in oral history. It was somebody who technically just put up the equipment, and I don't remember now whether he asked me or didn't ask questions, or just told me, now tell me your story during the war and the Holocaust, and I poured it out, and maybe in a quite superficial way. And this interview, a person came from Yad Vashem, luckily. She was not only a technical interviewer, but she apparently also studied oral history and worked in oral history previously in London, I think she told me later or before the interview. And she prompted me and asked me very specific questions. And I tried to answer them.
I would also say that from the standpoint of someone who was observing or watching the interviews, there was a world apart in terms of the quality of the interviewer between 1993 and 2017, and helped Shimon, I would say, come out a little bit and be more, talk about more intimate things.
Now let's go to some examples.
No, I want to ask you, can you talk about your grandparents, for example, your grandfather? You talk much more intimately, and then also I learned something very interesting about, I didn't know before, when you talked about, because Shimon's grandparents were not saved. They were caught. And if one of you could say something about the fact that they were, you and your mother were saved and your grandparents
were apprehended.
No,
first I'll say a few words about my grandpa Fisher. And then I'll say a few words about how they were caught and shot or killed, anyhow, perished. I remember my grandpa much more distinctly than my own father. And why? Because my father was apprehended and shot at the Jewish cemetery on the outskirts of Zhezhany on the 12th of June 1943. But with my grandpa Fischl, I was in hiding between June 43 and until December or January 44. And he was the closest person physically, and I would say also emotionally and intellectually, because we were lying. It was a place that we couldn't stand up at all, either lie or sit up. And I was right near to him, and day and night, he would talk to me, he would teach me things, we would discuss things, and maybe even he taught me to read Polish. I don't remember. So I was very close to my grandpa Fisher. And by the way, for those who have some interest in human psychology, I think that the fact that I was with my grandpa Fisher so closely, and he lives on in my memory so closely, and I again don't want to brag, but people say, and I feel, that I'm a very good grandpa. And for this we have to bring the witnesses, my grandchildren.
Okay,
but anyhow, now the story of the end, the tragic end of Grandpa Fischl and my grandma, his wife, was that when the Ukrainian woman in the village of Rai agreed to take in my mother and me, she also agreed in a day or two to come to the, not far from the hiding place in the ghetto, in the empty ghetto, and take the grandparents. But the grandparents on the way were discovered by some youngsters, whether Polish or Ukrainian local youngsters, and delivered to the local police. I don't know the details, whether the local Ukrainian auxiliary police or to the local German gendarmeria, I'm not sure. Anyhow, and I knew nothing about what happened to them. We of course knew that they never came and they were apprehended, so we could assume what was their end. But when Karol Kadogny came in 1986 to be our guest, he spent a whole month with us in my house. And when he got his Righteous Gentile medal and so on, as a historian, I also interviewed him and recorded that interview. And I used that interview in writing my book about Zhezhany, of course. And he told me that it was known, at least to some people in the city, that they were apprehended, taken to the local prison, held in that prison for a few days, and then executed. And for years and years, I never thought about what happened to them during those few days in prison. And only much, much later, when I was maybe 50 years old or more, I started to be aware of the fact how these two elderly or old in those days people did not admit to this where we were hiding, because they knew where we were hiding. And there's no question that they were beaten or tortured or whatever to reveal these facts. So that's the story with Grandpa Fisher.
So I want to say, for our purposes, one of the reasons we wanted to do this interview, because there are changes or additions in Shimon's testimony, and the most important addition in 2017, and I know his history very well, but this was all brand new for me when I listened to this, was about your Uncle Vovo. And it must have been very painful. You had to make maybe say what you said in 2017, but it seems to me that you decided that this was the time that you had to say something that you had never said before. Am I right about that?
Yes. There were some, in a way, unpleasant facts also connected with my family and with our hiding and so on. I would say two. Which one should I start? Maybe the one with the police, yes, because that came earlier. And both had to do with my uncle, who, by the way, saved me. If not this uncle, I wouldn't be alive today. But to get a little bit of the feeling background, how many minutes? We still have some? Okay. Okay. So you can imagine the situation of a medium town in eastern Poland, in eastern Galicia, Kresy, Rzeszany, with a population of some 15,000 total, plus refugees, that we have no data on that. I assume that at least a few thousand refugees came from the western part of Poland, among them a father and a son. The son is about 20, 22, 23 years old, very good looking, and very un-Jewish good looking. Blonde hair, curly hair, blue eyes, and very, as in Polish we say, przystojny młody człowiek. A good looking young fellow. And my aunt, my mother's younger sister, Malcha, who was very clever but not very good looking, let's say, but she succeeded in the competition, in the local competition, to catch her future husband. Okay? And we are together. And now that young man, whom we all called until his late age, we called him Vovo, or in Hebrew, Zev, he was taken into or mobilized, whichever way you can, I don't know exactly the details, into the local Jewish police, which worked with the local Jewish council, with the Judenrat. And exactly what he did or didn't do, I have no idea for how many months or weeks he was working in that capacity, but being a Jewish policeman and surviving after the war wasn't the best of things, let's say, and we never discussed it inside the family, and we never discussed it with other people, and I never told it in any of my testimonies, and I even didn't write about it in my book about Rzeszany, which was published in 2002, when I think he still was alive. And that's the answer. As long as he lived, I automatically or naturally or instinctively didn't want to talk about it. And at the end, I had the feeling, more as a historian and as a person who gives maybe his last testimony, to strive to paint, to provide all the details, not only the good ones, but also the unpleasant ones. And that's when the first time over all these years, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, first time that I revealed that fact. That's one. Another thing, another story is what I call the love story.
And I should just say that there were one or two sentences about this in his book, but in his 2017 interview, he really goes into it. So maybe you want to talk about the love story for a moment.
The love story.
If you don't mind.
If not a love story, I wouldn't be saved and I wouldn't be sitting today. And as many love stories, they are complex, complicated, not very simple, and especially during times of war. And
morally complex, I would say.
What?
Morally complex.
And more, we'll see in a minute. Anyhow, my uncle is also, unlike most of the Jews, he is a professional driver and mechanic, auto mechanic. And therefore he has also more chances to survive because he can be used for, in his capacity. And he is really used by, I don't know which authority, German authority, to transport building bricks from the factory on the outskirts of Brzeżany to the center of Brzeżany. And as it happens, the brick factory is located right near the outskirts, the village of Raj. And you can guess what happened then. And one day he meets this Ukrainian woman whose husband was taken for compulsory labor in Germany, and she stays in the village with 2 children, a boy of 4 and a girl of 8, 9. And then the love story starts. I don't know the details. I was then a boy of 7, 8, hiding in the attic in the empty Brzeżany ghetto. But my uncle, with the consent of his Jewish wife, agrees that my uncle will get involved with that Ukrainian woman, and he will promise her that after the war he will divorce his Jewish wife, marry her, and take her and her children to a town near Lodz. Polish people here maybe will know, the town of Brzeżany. By the way, similar name to Brzeżany, but these are 2 completely different locations where his family has a huge house. And to this fact, I can testify that he didn't lie. Because I was in Brzeżany and I took a photo of a really huge, dilapidated house, but it was property, anyhow. So that's how we survived, because of that story, and of that love story, and of that false story that they told this Ukrainian woman. So then somebody may come and argue, so how come that she got the righteous Gentile, at least from my point of view? The answer is this, again, complex. But in many other cases, such a woman may argue or tell the Jewish part, I love you, or I like to help you, I'll save you and take on the responsibility, dangers, etc. But I don't care for your Jewish wife. Just get rid of her. And I think humanely, not humanely, but maybe as for human beings, it's quite natural. One should consider all the aspects of human behavior. But she didn't do it. She agreed to keep his Jewish wife. And not only that, when they begged her to bring that wife's older sister with a small boy and 2 old grandparents, she agreed also to save them. And that's why she completely deserves that title.
He married there?
Pardon? And now comes, okay, now, good. Did he marry her? Like in most cases, in some cases, Jewish men married the local, not Ukrainian, but Polish women. There were a number of cases. I don't know these things. But in my case, he didn't marry her. He didn't marry her, but the maximum that my uncle and my aunt offered that Ukrainian woman is, and they thought that that's a step, you know, something nice to do. They offered to adopt her young daughter by the name of Anya and take her with them to Poland and wherever they would go, like into the better world, into the Western world. But of course the woman said no, because she didn't want to part with her daughter. So here you have also a moral issue, which Jews usually do not consider. Maybe those of you who know the story written by a woman whom I used to know, she's dead now, she contributed a lot to Bar Ilan University. Yehudit, what was her name? Also a love story. Also a love story. She lived in New York. I just cannot remember her name. I may get it. And she was saved by a young Ukrainian policeman, which Ukrainian policemen were maybe the most dangerous people to Jews in that area of eastern Galicia, today western Ukraine. And they were in love, and they lived together for a while. And the same story, she promised to stay with him, and her family promised that she will stay with him. Nothing happened. They just disappeared.
I mean, the point that I want to raise, because they're putting pressure on us, they're giving us 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
So the point that I want to raise, that it's very interesting that you talk about changes in testimony. None of these things were raised in your interview in 1993, and things that some families might consider to be dirty laundry that you wouldn't want to air in public, you bring those things up in 2017. Another thing that's interesting is that you, unlike many other survivors and many other historians, often place an emphasis, and even especially more so in 2017 than you had earlier, on positive aspects. For example, I'm thinking of the post-war period. You spent a year in Brzezany after liberation, and then you were 5 years in Łódź, and you talk, when I think about post-war Poland, I think of Kielce, I think of anti-Semitism, I think of...
You think of hundreds, if not more, Jews killed,
yes, and
by Poles.
And you emphasize the positive. Why do you do that?
Maybe that's my natural inclination, to see more positive than negative. But to tell you the truth, I, as a child, and that's more for child psychology to explain, to analyze.
But this is what you remember.
That's what I remember, and what stays with you in your head or in your heart, that's how you see things. These are very individual, personal, maybe one-sided things. But I remember that 1 year between summer 44, summer 45, in Brzezany, right near that Okopisko cemetery where thousands of Jews were killed, murdered, including my own father.
And your grandparents.
And the grandparents. I, as a child, never thought about it. Never thought about it. Besides that, out of hundreds and hundreds of Jewish children in Brzezany, less than 10 survived. I was one of them. And the few, 7, 8, 9 children, we used to play and run around the center of town and play day by day. And that's what stayed in my head.
So as we're coming to the end of our interview, though, I'm sure people want to talk.
One more remark about Łódź. Usually the general picture is that post-war was trauma, loneliness, etc., etc. My 4.5 or 5 years in Łódź was a very happy time for me. I was only in a Jewish Zionist surrounding. That's an important fact. I didn't suffer from anti-Semitism. I was not close, almost no relations with Poles, only with Jews and Zionist organizations. And that's why I remember those years as good years.
So we have 2 minutes left. I want to make 2 points. First of all, as a historian myself, as someone who watched 3 interviews, I've read all of your books, know you very well, is that for those of you who do any type of oral history, or you examining testimony, a Holocaust survivor testimony, any other testimony, you have to look at the entire picture over a long range of time. If you only look at one testimony or another testimony, you're just getting a snapshot. But it's clear to me that if you want to know a person's entire composite history, you have to look at it all. It's not enough just to look at one, and you have to try to trace the changes over time and try to understand why those changes happen. The last thing I want to ask you for our audience is, after you've given all of your interviews, it's almost a silly question, but I have to ask anyway. Any lessons, any moral, what would you say, why did you give these interviews anyway? What did it mean to you to do all of this?
Apparently, I had the need to get it out of me, and besides that, a little bit of exhibitionism. A little bit of exhibitionism. Already as a youngster in the Hebrew Zionist school in Lodz, I was one of those kids who were always chosen for recitation of poems and so on. And that's, by the way, how my filming career started.
I know very
I
well.
was one of those who were selected to play a role in the famous now...
because of us famous.
Also because of you, because Gaby wrote articles about this film. And that's, by the way, how we met.
Yeah. Unsere Kinder. The last Yiddish film made in Poland in 1948.
In Yiddish-speaking film with Jigan and Schumacher, those of you who know the famous comedians. So I had this tendency to, how do you say, show and tell, or tell and show. So,
and as a survivor, though, apart from your own duty, do you want to leave something for generations to come?
Yes, I would, in the opening of the film, my returns, Shimon's returns, I say that the Holocaust had not only negative aspects, but also some positive aspects, like good relations among people, saving people, and I would say trying to be introspective, as we say in Hebrew, psychologia begrush. I would say that seeing positive and good things in people helped me to live through my life. This one thing, being rather optimistic, and also pre-war years, just very few years, until 41, 35, 41, until the age of 6, I had an extremely happy childhood. I was an only son. I was very much, how do you say?
Spoiled rotten.
Spoiled. Everybody was dancing and running around me. And these few years gave me a lot to continue and to not get depressed and not get a very sad impression of what's going on. I look for the good. Okay.
As a survivor, do you feel that Yad Vashem and Lochamei Beit Lochamei Hagetaot, Ghetto Fighters House, do they do an adequate job of telling the story of the Holocaust?
Generally, I think yes. Sometimes even overdoing. I don't know. Sometimes it's difficult to tell you people who deal with that subject so intensively. It again depends for what purposes you do it. Looking at Yad Vashem, my relationship with Yad Vashem is very complex. On the one hand, I see the huge amount of work that they are doing. On the other hand, I don't know, and I'm sorry if I use some very critical expressions. Whenever I come to Yad Vashem, I see groups and groups and groups of young people, of soldiers, of units, walking there and there and there and being given lectures. My question is this: what is the result of this? How are these young people affected? Who are the people who lecture to them? What are the messages by lecturing to them, and so on? I leave it to your judgment. But one thing I can tell you clearly: when my prime minister, the current prime minister, Mr. Netanyahu, every year comes to the Holocaust ceremony at Yad Vashem and gives his speech and uses it for political purposes, I want to throw up. I wrote it in a newspaper, a short letter, something which may sound funny and primitive, 2 or 3 years ago. 2-3 sentences. I wrote something like that. Last evening, I watched and heard Prime Minister Netanyahu talk at Yad Vashem. My gut feeling was, as a child survivor of the Holocaust and as a historian of the Holocaust, that he stole the Holocaust from me and is using it for manipulative purposes in his politics. Very strong statement, but that was my gut feeling. And I get back to contemporary situations in different ways, which culminated in the famous or infamous agreement between the two governments. They are using history for their political purposes. I say, damn you. Leave history for historians. Don't manipulate with history.
Okay. Maybe that's a good way to end.